Going to now transition into our final panel, which is on plant consciousness. So we're going to go perhaps a little deeper even into our inquiry into the higher dimensions of Mother Earth. And we're going to be joined by Eric Sinclair and Jasmine Verdi, and we're lucky to have Mountain Girl rejoining our final panel for this wonderful discussion. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Eric Sinclair, who has been a chronicler of the psychedelic into the higher dimensions been going through for many years, and it's an exciting time right now as we'll be learning in this thoughtful discussion for the next 45 minutes. Welcome, Eric.
Hi, Michael. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're on. You're beaming out.
Great. Thanks for having me. Hi, I'm Eric Sinclair, and let's see. I've been writing the Stuff Stoners Like blog for about 15 years now, documenting the changing cannabis culture, as well as what's happening with other plant medicines like mushrooms and other entheogens and psychedelics. And today we're talking about consciousness expanding plants that have existed for thousands of years and are just now re-emerging in the spotlight. It's a really exciting time. I'm excited to have these panelists, and I'm excited to be here. So many people believe that psychedelics, they've kind of played this key role in human evolution. And there's no question that psychedelic therapy offers all these great benefits for treating things like stress and anxiety and PTSD and other psychological issues, and there's this fascinating renaissance underway and soon to be legal therapeutic applications. So let me introduce our panelists. We have Ed Rosenthal. He's written about cannabis for decades and has sold a couple million grow books. And he's also published a couple mushroom grow books, including a famous one by Terrence and his brother, Dennis McKenna. We also have Carolyn Mountain Girl Garcia. She was speaking a little bit earlier today. She's written one of the first grow books. It's called Primo Plant, I believe. She's famous for traveling the country as a merry prankster, turning on a generation of youngsters and others. And she's been an important figure in the counterculture ever since then. And then finally, we have Jasmine Verdi. She's been working for a leading publisher of psychedelic content. And she's pretty up to date with the current landscape of consciousness expanding plants like, and entheogens and other psychedelics. So I think, why don't we start with you, Jasmine? So there's obvious this new renewed interest in psychedelics. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience in the industry and kind of what you've seen in their rise in popularity?
Yeah, so I've been working for Synergetic Press for about 2.5 years now. And I guess before my involvement with the press, I've been a member of the psychedelic community for longer, just involved in different capacities, maybe about 6 years or so, kind of going to conferences and networking in that space. And to be honest, compared to the first psychedelic conference I went to several years ago until the ones that I've been going to more recently, they have become so much more popular, where everyone and their mum is vying for a ticket, and I think that the medical research has come a long way, and so the science is kind of saying good things about psychedelics. So I think it's giving people increased permission to use them in a sense. But I also think that books like Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind are also opening up doors for people when it comes to psychedelics, to the point where, I mean, like, a couple years ago when I told my parents, like, oh yeah, I'm working for a publishing company publishing content on psychedelics, they seemed kind of concerned. But now, it's something that they're kind of, it's more normal, it's more acceptable, to the point where they're telling me to watch documentaries about psychedelics on Netflix with them. So yeah, it's definitely a changing scene, and it's definitely skyrocketed in the last couple of years especially.
Awesome. Well, let me ask you, Carolyn. So, you've been involved with it, almost since the beginning. And so the Dead, and they've kind of taken this Dionysian approach where, you know, like the acid tests, yeah, for instance, where they got lots of people together and they experienced psychedelics together, and there was this, you know, it was a cathartic, you know, moment for them all. So can you tell us about that approach, which is kind of different than what we are seeing now,
Well,
and what was different?
you know, it really seemed important at the time that we do this. And I'm hoping you can hear me okay.
Yeah.
Good. It seemed important at the time. You know, it seemed like the world was just crying out for something else besides the military industrial complex that was going on in those days, in the mid 60s. So and I keenly remember my first experience with our friend LSD. And it had a huge impact on me because it awakened some sense in my brain of global consciousness. And suddenly, you know, not only did I have that, we expanded the circle and kept expanding the circle of people that would experience a sense of global consciousness. And with all the information that floods into the mind on your first uh, trip on psychedelics, it is a life-changing event. And I'm really happy you mentioned Michael Pollan, because I had a chance to hear him speak here in Eugene just before the shutdown. And he gave the most compelling talk. And if you have a chance to ever hear him speak on this topic, I heartily recommend it. It was, he had 10 people come up and ask questions at the end, and each one asked us a question that was so totally different from all the other questions. It made my head reel, because I suddenly realized how many different threads that psychedelics bring us to in our own consciousness expansion, and in our thought patterns, in our religious feelings, in our sensitivities. And it's such an enormous gift. It's a shame to continuously color it as you know, too dangerous for the common man. I think it's very good for the common man.
That's great. I love hearing that. So let's talk about, you know, well, let's talk about the difference between treating yourself and maybe working in it with a therapist, and working with it in a clinical setting. Maybe Jasmine, you want to talk a little bit about what you've seen? You know, tell us what's the benefit of maybe treating yourself with, you know, we're not just talking about plant, um, you know, materials here. You know, we're talking about LSD, we're talking about ketamine, and we're talking about other synthetics. You know, MDMA, like MAPS is bringing
Well, let's
MDMA
not talk
to.
about those. Let's not get them mixed up.
You want?
There's a very clear line there.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Tell me why do you see this very clear line?
Ketamine is horse tranquilizer. It came in a big jar from Mexico and cost $10. You know, that was 40 years ago. It's not come from a plant. We're really trying to narrow this down a little bit. I think, you know, even though LSD is a little questionable because it doesn't really appear in plants in a pure form, I don't think, you know, but we have mushrooms, and we have a lot of different kinds of mushrooms, as it turns out. And so it's a wide global phenomenon that psychedelics exist in the wild. And people have taken them up all over the world in one form or another. And if it's a gift of the creator, that's great. And if it's a gift of evolution, that's a wonderful thing. And we need to know more. But at the same time, people are making more different ones in the lab that also seem to unlock the inner realms of consciousness, which is kind of amazing.
Jasmine, would you care to weigh in about that, about the synthetics versus plant-based medicines?
Yeah, I also kind of like to make that separate, or designate them separately,
Sure.
in the sense that well, psychedelics and plant medicines, there's a big overlap, and you know, some people view them as the same thing, but at the same time, for me, I love nature. I love taking things in an integral way, in a whole way, and I think that there is so much more to a mushroom than just psilocybin. There is so much more to ayahuasca than just DMT. There are so many different alkaloids in the plant that act together in synergy to give a complete cohesive effect. And in essence, I think it is the spirit of the plant coming through. Not to say that synthetics or like synthetic psychedelics don't have that. And I think to an extent there are good reasons to take synthetics sometimes over whole plants. In the case of peyote, for example, I mean, it's used by the Native American Church. It is a sacred sacrament, and it's critically endangered. So I would advise people, like, don't go out and buy peyote on the internet. Don't go out and don't go out seeking it necessarily in the desert, because it's so critically endangered, and it's so sacred to the Native Americans, for example. So that's a case where I think like taking mescaline over the whole plant is actually better.
So Carolyn, what would you say to someone who's inexperienced, and they've heard about psychedelics, and they've heard that it could maybe help them with their depression? How would someone what would you say?
I would merely suggest, set and setting in those protocols. Be careful where you are, but also go light. Go light that first few times around. Let your body and reactions get used to an altered state, because it is deeply altering, and then you come back and you have to go wash the dishes. It can be distressing to return to your apartment or your beat up car or whatever it is. I feel like grim reality and the psychedelic vision sometimes have a hard time coexisting. So it does change you, and in many subtle and overt ways. But as we get used to using psychedelics, we change less. And I think we don't need to take a lot. We don't need to take it often. We just need an update every once in a while.
Do you think that maybe so I was lucky enough to interview Tim Scully earlier this year, creator of Orange Sunshine, and he said that psychedelics, when he first started making them, he thought they carried a message with them, like this message of peace and unity and love. Mm-hmm. And then after being accidentally dosed by making it over some time, he came to realize that it's kind of more of an amplifier of messages that maybe you've already had. Like in essence, it doesn't turn someone who's an asshole into being a nice person. Can you speak about that, perhaps?
Well, we should ask Ed about that. I mean, I see you over there, Ed, and I know you're having thoughts about this. And as a person who, probably has tried psychedelics and then gone on to have a wonderful career in all of these things, I'm just curious also about what you think.
Do we have you here, Ed?
He's there. He's there.
So, in Doors of Perception, Huxley said that from the time that we're infants, maybe even fetally, he didn't say that, but it could be, that we're taught certain sets and set perceptions, ways of looking at the world and of perceiving the world, so that two people from different cultures can see the same act and see different things from that, whatever that act is. And so we're boxed in by these sets and set perceptions. And what he said was that psychedelics lessen the brain's ability to use those filters. So new thoughts come through, and new feelings, emotions, new everything comes through that have been boxed in a certain way, and then they can come out. And that's, like you mentioned that that it's more profound at the very beginning, and then every once in a while get a touch up or something like that, you know. But I think, first of all, I think that we can always use large doses. I think that I understand microdosing, and I've done a little bit of microdosing, and I'm not. I think that that's really good, and for some people, it's really beneficial. But I also think that something that breaks through those sets and set perceptions, even the ones that we're holding now. I mean, we're holding new sets and set perceptions that don't let us look at the world in a different way. So you can always use that. I'm not even like annually, every couple of years, have a few of them. I think the thing that I worked for a brokerage firm. I was an assistant compliance officer, you know, for a stock brokerage firm many years ago. And one week I went in, and every day during I took acid for 4 days, and you know, it was like a bonus. On the 5th day, I didn't have to take any. And
Excuse me.
And that let me see that this was not going to be my profession. You know,
Yeah.
I think of it more as a job. So so that so I think that what I meant by breaking through your sets and set perceptions. And like, that doesn't sound very spiritual, but you know, when you say that, you know, you're going to find a different path. You know?
So I was going to ask you if you feel like it's different now that you've gotten quite a bit older, as I have. I'm 74, and I approach psychedelics delicately at this point, because
You're healthy,
I'm
right?
very healthy.
Do you
You
take
know,
prescriptions?
what's that?
Do you take prescriptions?
No, hell no.
I don't
I
either.
want with
You're
prescription.
healthy.
Whoa.
You're ready to listen. You come down, we'll take acid together. Actually, I
You know,
don't like
maybe we
acid.
should do
I
that.
don't like acid these days as much as mushrooms. And there's these new mushroom stores that want to open up.
Oakland, God bless the
And
Oakland.
NSF and
Yeah.
SF too.
We're trying to get it through here, but Eugene's a little bit behind Oakland as far as their reasoning process
Yeah.
about legalizing psilocybin. But I just think to be able to go down to the church down the street and knock on the back door and get a little handful of mushrooms, that's just phenomenal.
But you see, with these stores, it's not going to be getting a handful of mushrooms. It's like going from the dealer culture, the old dealer culture, to going into a store where there are many varieties and choices.
That's going to be interesting.
Right.
Because they're all different. And if there's different varieties, they're all a little different. So,
exactly.
Or a lot different.
Exactly. You're going to have to come down here and we're going to experiment. And see
oh, I come down there. I have a place to stay in Oakland. And so, yes, Ed, you're going to hear from me.
Okay.
You're on.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, Ed. So yeah, I mean, you know, I've been to the church in Oakland. It was Trixie who told me about it. And
I've never been to that.
Oh, I'll take you. We'll go. But
Okay.
So you're an expert. You've watched the cannabis industry kind of, you know, we've seen it turn into a legal industry, and you know, a lot of people have been left out. And you know, how you've been on the front lines and you've seen all this happen. You've been an activist for decades. You've paid the price. What wisdom can you draw on to help this?
First of all, Steve D'Angelo was talking about the people who are still in jail.
Yeah,
and that's true. But because of these laws, people like they're terming out, and there aren't new people going in. So just the idea that people who might have been going to jail, might have been going to prison, are now perfectly legal to do what they want to do. It's worth that. Now, I was opposed to the Washington Initiative, and I thought that that Prop 64 really sucked.
Mhm.
I think that they were giveaways, but here's the thing: 80 between six in all these legal states, between 60 and 80% of the transactions are still outside of the regulated system.
Yeah, understood.
So, you know, um, up in Oregon where you are, Carolyn,
Mhm.
you know that people can get this license to grow 49 plants for personal use. Now, a friend of mine, he's a very big user because he must be, because he has like 49 plants, each weighing about 15 pounds.
Oh my God.
So you know what? I mean, he's using like 10 pounds a week. I cautioned him, you're using too much, you
Yeah.
know, on a personal level there. You're using too much. So I believe that somehow, I don't know what's happening to that stuff, but he seems to be able to use it all. And by the next year, he needs more. So, so as I said, a very high percentage of the sales are staying within the community. And think about this: if they're going to these corporations, money that used to be exchanged within the community is leaving the community,
True.
right?
Mhm.
So I think that there should be a system where
Hi,
small
DJ
farmers,
Farrell.
and I'm not talking about, I don't even care about 10-pound farmers or anything like that, but people who are growing 100 pounds, 50 pounds
Mhm.
can have sort of a registered market where they can pay taxes, where it would be legal for them to pay taxes and still stay relatively unregulated. And I think that we really need that. And I think that it's right for them to pay taxes. Everybody pays taxes, or everybody should, right? You want work, you want schools, you pay taxes.
And there's more to it than that. I feel like when people step into growing and they don't really know what they're doing, mistakes happen. And last year in Oregon, we had an early fall, and some of these growers, got this guy. Well, I drove by his place a few times. He never pulled his plants. He just let them rot right there in the rain in the ground. This is a disaster for anybody that lives near the guy because he's not playing by any sensitivity or any rules. Um, he just left him there, or she, we don't know. But that's so
That's awful.
irresponsible because it sends billions of mold spores out into the universe to make it hard for everybody else. And so, I think there is some sense of, well, my dad was an agricultural extension agent. I'll come clean. He worked for the Department of Agriculture in New York. And his responsibility, and some was where I probably get some of this was to go around and tell farmers what not to do. And I feel like we all need to share this information and be able to get on each other's cases when we see some real difficult situations emerging, and be brave about it.
So, Carolyn, you mentioned that you tried LSD. Do you want to tell me a little bit about how that came into your life, and then
Oh, I had gotten turned on to weed in Palo Alto. Oh, actually, my first psychedelic experience was I was working as a lab tech at age 17 at Stanford at the organic chemistry department. And a sample came across my desk. Of course, I had read Life magazine. I had read the article about Leary and what he had to say. This came out somewhat before that. So I was primed. And when this one certain sample came to me, I was working the night shift. So I was in the lab At age 17, which was kind of irresponsible, but but there I was down there in the basement with the mass spectrometer with this sample from Africa, and it turned out to be ibogaine. And of course, I ate half of it, and had a really rough time, is all I can say. And it really knocked my socks off and made me different for a number of days. And I didn't really come back to normal for quite a while. In fact, probably never. But at least I got my sense of humor back after a while. But that was unrefined iboga root, and God knows what I was getting myself in for. Anyway, long story short, I never did that again. And after I got fired, I ran into the merry pranksters and the bus, and they gave me a little tiny little bit of LSD, and I had a wonderful time. And and I realized, oh, this higher consciousness thing is a really beautiful place for me. And it kind of healed up that anxiety and difficulty that I'd had coming out of the previous experience. So I can't say enough good things about some of our plant allies too. So they've been big parts of my when I'm seeking direction. I think I go to psychedelics, to mescaline and so on.
What about morning glory seeds? Was that something that you were eating those on the bus?
Well, everybody tried them in Palo Alto later that year, but unfortunately, I think they were dosed with some fungicide.
Okay.
But I never got very far with that.
Okay.
That didn't work out.
I can talk to you about this stuff all day, but I want to hear from Jasmine. Why don't
Yes, we want to hear from Jasmine.
Let's hear about what got you into psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it all started with an interest in Buddhism in my, early teenage years, and then somehow I got turned on to Terence McKenna, and I had read a lot of McKenna and listened to many hours of him on YouTube. And I guess in my teenage years, I did smoke weed, and I think that opened me up to a whole world of ideas. And so I had this inclination, like, okay, I really want to try psychedelics at some point, and when I'm ready, they'll find me. And I mean, I grew up in Cyprus. It's a small island. These substances are really hard to get a hold of. I wasn't even trying necessarily, but it wasn't something that was necessarily available where I was living. And so when I finally went to university in the UK, I had this really high dose mushroom experience. And, I had kind of curated it in a sense that I had planned it. I weighed out the dose, I had fasted, I had, selected a playlist. I had really gone into it with the mindset of like, okay, well, I'm going to sit here with my mind fold and see what's inside. And I think that whole experience just, I was kind of like, well, what just happened to me? I need to learn more about this. And I guess that's what started getting me involved in the psychedelic community. After that, I went to a conference, and I started reading books and getting familiar with people. And I don't know, I guess it's just kind of taken over my life, just trying to understand. But to be honest, they've been really great teachers for me, really profound teachers for me. And I think that's what's really ignited my path.
What's really interesting is that when you hit upon Buddhism, there's this really interesting connection between psychedelics and Buddhism. And I know, Timothy Leary back then, he wrote like the Book of the Dead, talking about the different states of transitioning. Can you speak about that, Caroline? Do you know about the connection between Buddhism and psychedelics? That was back then, in the early, the 60s, during the, Buddhism was new and fresh, kind of like psychedelics. Do you?
I'm not a religious person per se, so I can't really speak to the larger picture. I can just say what my experience was. In my first little acid trip, okay, I could hear the Tibetan monks chanting in the caves. And it blew me it blew my mind. I couldn't believe I'd never heard it, but I knew what it was because what they were saying, because I could understand enough of it. I had read about it. So it was startling and it was beautiful and it made me feel safe. And I think that there's a deep connection there in the world of the mind, in the mental. There's some mental connection that humans have with each other that has not really been quantified. That's natural, a very natural thing. And you don't have to be standing next to someone to feel their thoughts and intentions. It's this is sensitive stuff, and I think everybody has to grapple or study this on their own because I don't have any answers here except that it does happen to me. And
That's great.
it was like a revelation that these old religions had that connection between minds across a globe.
Yeah, I think Buddhism is what it's like the study of the mind, and so from what I understand, monks were they would meditate and they would reach different states of mind that sometimes psychedelics you could reach on psychedelics. And it's almost as if I've heard that you can almost skip ahead on the path of the Dharma by taking psychedelics. But Ed, you were talking to me the other day about your first mushroom experience, and you had something about mother-in-laws and garlic. And I've been dying to hear this story. Can you tell us about this?
I'm sorry, mothers-in-law and you have
And
me.
garlic. Remember you were talking about tell me about your first mushroom experience. We wanted to talk about that.
My first mushroom experience. Well, as I said, I remember my first trips were really acid trips. So the mushrooms came much later.
Yeah.
Than, well, you use what's available. But I really don't remember that much about
Okay,
it.
well, so your first trip was LSD, which is what ergot. So it's somewhat, it's a synthetic. And we were kind of talking about that synthetic versus entheogens and plant medicines. Do you have an opinion?
Well, I'll say this about cannabis and also about psychedelics. In terms of the substances, we're all dead men walking. And instead, what we'll be able to do is put on some electronic net over our head that will send waves and give us dial in the experience that you want. And so we'll do it without substances, but just with something that regulates brain waves or mediates them or causes the brain to put out different substances in some way. And so that we would be able to refine the consciousness that we'd like to have at the time.
I love it. So let's talk again about, so Caroline, like you participated, in the prankster scene, and Leary brought, he made psychedelics popular, and in a sense, kind of, it scared, the establishment, and, people were afraid of it, and then, psychedelics, heavy-handed law enforcement came about. Would you do anything differently, maybe looking back, knowing, what happened?
Oh, wow. I don't know if we do anything differently. What we were really trying to do is to encourage people to have fun and move their bodies and dance and not just sit somewhere on a rock and meditate. We weren't about that. We were more about introducing, as far as the acid test is concerned, more about introducing people in a joyous environment, in an interesting environment, an environment that changed continuously, and kept shifting in lights and music and performances. Yes, there was it was entertainment in a way, but it seemed to keep people pretty safe and satisfied. So I think tuning a room, and this was part of my job because I was the sound engineer, tuning a room, you try to get the balance between the stereo speakers so that you could have the sense of stereo. Um, and then we went to quadraphonic there, or we tried to, and all of these things were cutting edge. So these various technologies were being birthed just with psychedelics at the same time. Suddenly people became obsessed with sound quality. So I think that Ed, your idea about pushing something into the brain to make it react in a different way, music is a huge part of that. And I've lived in a musical commune for many years, and those were the highest high moments, just thrilling of great music. And I feel that these two things go together. It's another thing to go sit out in a field and have a silent trip, and it's just not quite as much fun.
I know exactly what you're talking about. You're talking about joyousness, and certainly, that's what San Francisco was about, rather than like meditation as much.
Mm-hmm.
I think that as people have gotten more into meditation, I don't know, I feel that you don't hear as much about joyousness. And I'm not only talking about post-COVID, I'm talking about pre-COVID. People,
Oh yeah.
uh, part of it is an economic thing that, college, like people could come to San Francisco, work part-time, save enough money to take a trip to wherever for months and months. And now, the people are working two jobs, so that the people the same age, at the same age today, have so much more responsibility because of the swimming against the tide. So it's changed
Right.
the psychology of it. I mean, when even 30 years ago, kids would take a vacation during the summer between summer vacation in their college careers, and they go someplace amazing or different, or to Europe or mountain climbing or whatever, experience different things. They can't do that. They're saving to pay the college bills. The work, they have to be working maybe two jobs. Oh, it's the summer, I can work two jobs. And they never get to the beach, so to speak. So, and that's that. That's that really has to change. People have to have room to develop. Like it's not just your career or paying the bills, but you really have to get what we experienced, which was joyousness.
Yes, and I think that Burning Man has done a lot for the current generation of explorers. It's given a place to be that's reasonably safe-ish, and you're unencumbered by too much surveillance, and it's where a lot of people were getting their introduction. So I don't quite know what's going to replace Burning Man, but these large events, I don't really want to go to a Southern rock and roll concert in Tennessee or Alabama. It doesn't sound psychedelic to me. Whereas I think we have a special thing here in the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast. And I want us to hang on to it and work with it. I think it's important. And if one of the cities, if Portland goes this way, it's going to be really very interesting in the upcoming election. I hope so.
You mean the importance meaning just the legalization of mushrooms and storage?
Yeah, it's a tight law. It requires a therapist to administer, and they have to be practiced. And that's not a bad way to start. And I think there's an awful lot of people that would be very interested in that. especially people who are getting older and want to put a notch in their belt before they go, basically. Yes, I did that.
Do you see like the future of mushrooms, like the future of cannabis? Do you want to see small time mushroom farmers, or
Oh,
is
I
that
think they're already out there.
well, we know they're out there, but is
Yeah.
that what we want to preserve going forward? Is that Jasmine? Why don't you talk about this? Do we,
Yes, please.
because do we want this craft mushrooms, or do we want clinically grown mushrooms? Tell us what we want.
Yeah, I would say I would prefer the small mushroom growers. I think it's really important that the commercial market essentially reflects the values of the community at large. Um, to be honest, I guess I don't necessarily know much about the legalization movement that essentially with weed becoming legal and cannabis and all of these things. I don't necessarily know how that developed, but I've definitely heard it echoed that with psilocybin and mushrooms now are following suit with the ways that cannabis was legalized and medicalized. And I just think it's really crucial that we learn from the mistakes of that community and keep the people that are, I don't know, fighting for this movement involved in it, essentially.
One of the things you've always fought for was the right to grow. That was really very important. And so what do you think? That's going to be extremely important to think about going forward with mushroom cultivation, correct?
Yes, and my publishing company, we have 2 books out about cultivation.
Yeah, tell us now. How did you? I mean, you are the Sherpa of Terrence McKenna and his brother Dennis's book. That was the first mushroom grow book that hit.
Well, there was another company that published it, and Carolyn McKenna, who owns the rights to the book, didn't really get along well, or just wanted to change publishers, and we've taken that and kept that book in print, and we have another book out as well.
It's fantastic. I think his wife did the illustrations in it.
I'd like to get a book out about the different varieties. Not that I would write it, but to publish that.
Absolutely.
That's really good for people.
Now, have you seen? Is there renewed interest in your the mushroom grow books? Have you with the popularity of it?
There's been a continuous interest. It's not they fell out of favor. It's just been underground a lot.
Okay. So, Carolyn, what have you been up to lately in terms of?
Well, just in the last couple of weeks, I've put in a huge garden. I'm sequestered out in the country, and this is the first time I've been in town in quite a while. And the computer's seeming a little alien, but so I just put in a huge garden. I grew 2 fabulous plants last year of cannabis, and I've got tons left over. My goodness, what are you going to do with all that? So I don't know. Well, we'll see what happens. But it's just like the more different kinds of mushrooms that people study, the more they find that have psychedelic attributes. So Paul Stamets certainly talks much about this, and I heartily recommend his film Fantastic Fungi.
That's great.
It's been making the rounds, and it's gorgeous. And it's a psychedelic movie, basically. And but what he doesn't say in the movie is how many different kinds of mushrooms there are globally that have, definitely have some stuff in them that changes your mind. And this is big information, because most of this stuff has never been studied by a mushroom studier. So,
well, have you any 3 of you, have you taken 2 different varieties of mushrooms and felt distinctly 2 different type of effects? No. So do you think that psilocybin has the same effect no matter what strain of mushroom?
Doubtful. because it's going to come with different different alkaloids along with it, all sorts of different things. Every mushroom species is going to taste a little different. I am certain.
Have you noticed a difference between indoor and like outdoor tree loving mushrooms in just effects?
Well, I'm a fan of the little tiny mushrooms that grow out on the Oregon coast, and
Azarescens.
they're lovely. You know, they're
Yeah.
just a lovely little thing, and there's lots of them out in the pasture sometimes if you're lucky enough to have a pasture. But it's, you know, these are gifts of nature, and they need our protection and our attention. So as people who know, that makes us cognoscenti, doesn't it? People who know. It's up to us and whoever's listening to be kind, you know, to be kind to the fungal world, because it's full of interesting things. And, you know, look closely is all I can say. Look closely and take your book.
Love it.
It's important.
All right.